Linda Hirsch, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education. The challenges faced by black boys in school have been the subject of research and discussion. But educators are becoming increasingly concerned with the unique challenges faced by black girls. According to federal data, their suspension rate is 6 times higher than white girls, and they represent over half of those disciplined in schools. Researchers are concerned with how the school system treats black girls, saying they are either rendered invisible or just viewed as problems. Today, City College professor Terri Watson joins me to discuss her research on black girls in schools, what they want, and what schools can do to better address their issues.
As most of the nation knows, so much attention has been given to black boys and men over the past 20 years or so in education research. So it is refreshing that we are now seeing a rightful inclusion of black girls and women, because they really are pushed out of schools in some uniquely gendered ways that haven't been fully considered. I'm often troubled when I hear well-meaning researchers and others make the case for more focus on black girls and women by sort of juxtaposing them with black boys and black men. And, practitioners and policymakers and administrators say, well, we got to do something to better support and improve educational outcomes for boys and young men of color, without understanding, again, that the girls of color are just slightly, sometimes not even like a whole percentage point higher. So I'm just hoping that, the case making and the rightful advocacy for, more attention to the experiences and needs and challenges of black girls and women are done in a way that, again, doesn't have us, sort of colliding with each other.
My guest today is Dr. Terri Watson, Assistant Professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Special Education at the City College of New York. Professor Watson is a native of Harlem. Her research examines the practices of urban school leaders and the impact of school reform on students and communities of color. Her current work examines the impact of school policies on the life chances of black girls. She is also co-editing a forthcoming issue of the Journal of Negro Education titled Why We Can't Wait, Re-examining the Opportunities and Challenges for Black Women and Girls in Education. Thank you so much for joining us today on EdCast,
Thanks
Professor
for having
Watson.
me.
We opened up with a very brief clip where Sean Harper talks about the importance of this issue. Why do you think it's really important to study black girls in schools right now?
Well, for several reasons. One being the very problems that black boys face, black girls also face, but based on the intersection of not only race but gender, it's oftentimes magnified.
So what are we seeing? What are some of the issues that we're seeing?
We're seeing the disproportionate amount of black girls disciplined for events that other girls are often not held to the same standards for. They're perceived as being loud or unruly or uncontrollable, when in essence they're not really seen at all.
Now, why was this issue of interest to you, both academically and personally?
Well, obviously as a black woman, and I also have a daughter myself, so I'm often concerned not just with my safety, but also her safety. And she just graduated from high school and off to college, and the very thing I want for her, I want for all black girls, is to be able to follow their dreams and live rich and full lives. And I find that schools oftentimes don't tap into kind of who black girls are. They're seen as a monolithic people, if you will, instead of looking at their individual traits and characteristics and being judged on their own merit. They're often grouped into or problematized when they rightly should not be.
How are they doing in terms of academics?
Well, nationally, they're doing better, if you will. There is growth, but not at the same speed, if you will, as their female counterparts. Most recently, in, I believe, 2014, the White House established the Council for Women and Girls, and they did a study looking at the academic gains, if you will, of women and girls. And while there was indeed growth, black girls did not grow at the same pace, if you will, as their peers did.
So they're lagging behind.
Very much
Let's
so.
talk a little bit about the study that you undertook. How did you undertake it? What was the format of the study? What did you do?
Well, I'm engaged in a longitudinal study at a large urban public high school looking at the successful practices of school leaders. And this study asked that I look at not just leadership, but I actually talked to parents, teachers, students, community activists and such about their perceptions of the school and leadership, and just kind of what we can do to make schools better, or what we need to know to make schools more effective with both an E and an A. And in talking to the students at the school site, I found that Black girls were very interested in telling me their story and sharing with me their experiences.
How many students did you speak with?
Spoke to roughly 25 students.
25. And you also, I read in your study that you also spent some time at the schools.
Right.
What did you do?
Not only did I shadow the principal, I walked around the school, I went into the cafeteria. I was there during the change of bells, which in a large urban high school can be a challenging time, to say the least. But I was simply there, just listening more than anything, and making note of what was happening, and most importantly, what wasn't happening that should have been happening.
So a kind of ethnography almost to put
Very much
yourself
so.
right there. Okay. Tell me a little about what the theoretical framework was for the study.
Thanks, Linda. This study used Patricia Hill Collins' Black feminist theory, and this theory essentially has 4 principles. The first is self-definition, and that's simply Black women and girls defining themselves for themselves. The second tenet is the lived experience, and that's simply the claims of the knower is considered truth. It's not to be unpacked or examined in a light that's not their own. What you say is your reality and your truth, and that's accepted. The third is the use of dialogue, and in essence, that's simply the exchange between both the speaker and the listener, and this empathy is practice, care, and it's simply just being considerate of what's being shared with you and honoring that. And lastly, and I think is most important, this final tenet of personal accountability. And that essence simply calls on Black women to use our collective power for the benefit of all Black women.
Now I noticed you sent me a chapter that I read, and it was really interesting. I think it was an article. You really pick up on this idea of hearing the voices and telling the story, and you interviewed a number of Black girls at the school that you were studying. Yes, it was a large urban high school, as you said. What were some of the things that you asked the participants in your study, and who were they in some way?
Okay, well, all of the Black girls, 6 in total, were all seniors. They were all at the school site for the entire high school experience. And I asked them, I guess, one of the most, profound questions was simply, how could we make this school better? What is it that you need? And most often, they simply wanted the things they need, or people to listen to them, meaning to not have, to be grouped into this, the Black girls, just that, to honor their individual experiences and narratives. Some of them I found suffer from depression. They are overwhelmed by not only the academics, but the perceptions of them coming from the media, coming from their peers.
How did they feel they're presented in the media? What were their concerns?
Well, some just looking at popular culture just as, being loud and rowdy, and it's a far cry from who they really are, but they felt oftentimes they had to live up to these expectations that didn't call on them to be better people. It actually perceived them in a deficit lens, and it didn't complement who they are as individuals, and more importantly, who they wanted to become as young women and mothers and wives eventually.
You mentioned, I think, that they were college-bound seniors. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you think the answers would have been different if you had talked to girls who were not college-bound?
I think so, because these girls, again, I chose them because they were at the school site and they had a rich experience, meaning they were there for all 4 years under the same leader, so they knew kind of the territory. And so they were able to navigate it and experience success in many ways. But even with their success, they also had challenges, and I wanted to know not only what their challenges were, but how they were able to overcome, and what, if they could say to themselves that in grade 9 what they would have needed, and that was to be listened to have more emotional support, to have maybe activities that not necessarily sports related, but just clubs in which everything from a book club to knitting clubs, just things that really spoke to what they enjoyed doing. It wasn't always running track or playing basketball. Many of them, you know,
Stereotype kind of things.
Exactly.
They didn't want to be limited to the stereotypical kinds of things.
right, or even just being asked what it is they like. You know, it could be everything from cooking to martial arts to things that just spoke to them as individuals, as opposed to, you know, what the school kind of put out there as possible. You know, here's what you have.
So what you're also saying, and I guess that's occurring to me now as we're speaking, is that if these girls who were academically successful were experiencing all these negative aspects of their time at school, how much more so exaggerated this then must be for those other girls who are not even experiencing that kind of academic success.
Right.
It must really be magnified for them. That's an interesting point for us to think about. We are going to look briefly at a brief clip that by Adrienne Dixon, who is another researcher in this area, and she basically is talking about the behavior that we see among some black girls that we disapprove of is actually the result of their response to their environment. So let's take a brief look, okay?
Historically, schools have not been places that welcome student agency. There are some of those spaces. They don't typically tend to be in low-income communities of color. I think when kids feel oppressed or repressed, that they respond in the language that they know. And sometimes that's talking back, sometimes it's not being compliant. And it's misguided interpretations of what it means to teach kids of color and low-income kids of color that they need to be heavily disciplined and heavily surveilled. But I think they're exercising their agency in that way. And that so that schools could recognize these behaviors aren't just because kids just want to be bad, that they're responding to an environment that doesn't help them feel free.
What do you make of this idea that the behavior is a response to the environment?
Well, it simply means that black girls oftentimes aren't respected or celebrated in schools, and so their actions are often reactions to hostile climates, and sort of like fighting fire with fire. And they haven't learned, or we haven't taught them, if you will, how to successfully communicate, you know, their lack of happiness, or here's what they need to be, you know, successful or to feel appreciated or valued. Instead, we constrain, we restrict, and it's demoralizing. It's in conflict with who they are, and as a in an effort to push back on that, then they become, you know, just what you thought they were initially, loud and unruly, when in essence they're simply responding to an atmosphere that the school itself has created, and unfortunately they continue to perpetuate systemically.
These videos that were posted of the 4 scholars talking about this issue, I was surprised to see some of the comments that were posted. And they were many of them were very negative. And a lot of them said, well, you know, the reason these girls are suspended so frequently is because they get into fights and they're very defiant, and they basically should learn to get with the program. I mean, they basically should learn to behave. There's certain rules on how to behave in school, and instead of complaining, they should learn how to follow those rules. And there were a lot of comments like that. What's your take on that?
Well, when they talk about, you know, I say acting the right way, is it the right way or the white way? Meaning, who are, you know, we to subjectively say what's appropriate and what's not. Yes, there are rules that have to be followed, but let's say it's dress code violation. If you and I both buy the same blouse, it may fit you one way and me another. So you're telling me that this blouse that I have on, that you have on the very same blouse, it just doesn't fit me right. And so for that, I'm disciplined for a dress code violation. Or if by nature I'm with my friends and we're excitedly talking and we can't just be happy and having a good time, are we being loud and defiant? Or if you tell us to be quiet, you know, what's the rationale? So it's not always the, you know, what happened. Oftentimes it's the why, and it's who's policing us. And if we were in a different skin or a different size, would our realities, you know, change? And if so, why? And that's part of the problem.
Now, you really then are referencing, I guess, some of the cultural differences, and I want to ask you, the New York City teaching corps is really predominantly white. Do you think that that is a contributor to some of the issues that we're seeing, that there just really is this cultural divide?
I think there's not as much as a divide as a disconnect.
Okay.
Many of the teachers are not from the schools that they teach in. They have no knowledge of the culture of many of the students, or even literally the language in which they speak. And so instead of honoring that, they come in and present their own paradigm that they expect students to align to, and this paradigm for the students is foreign. So it's almost like trying to fit a peg in a square, if you will.
So there's a kind of a mismatch. Now,
A cultural disconnect.
Mayor de Blasio has undertaken an initiative, you may be aware of this, to recruit more black male teachers. And he's putting out a lot of money to recruit more black men in the classroom. What do you think?
I think it's needed, but I think teachers of color are needed, particularly in communities of color. And while there are initiatives, rightly so, for black men, I think we need to be mindful that black women suffer from the very same fate as black men. It just isn't advertised as much, or it isn't talked about or funded equitably. And in the most, I guess, dire circumstances, agency doesn't come to black girls until it's often a reaction instead of being proactive.
Can you say what we mean by agency? Because you and I certainly use that term all the time, but for our viewers, what do we mean by that, by agency?
Agency is simply, for me, is when you give students the tools they need to be successful, when we set up environments where they can thrive.
And have some control over their environment.
Right, and we give them a voice. We work with not only students, but also with the parents and community members and teachers, as well as school leaders, to create an environment where students their needs are addressed, they're celebrated, they're respected, and they're afforded visibility. Like, we see them and we honor them and we respect them, and we do things that, speak life to them, instead of this deficit theory that we often view not just black boys, but also black girls.
Not too long ago, there was a video that went viral, and it was of a first grade teacher in a charter school, a Success Academy charter, in which she behaved in a very rude manner and condescending manner to a student in her class, a first grader, who did not do well in a math question.
Yes.
And it brought up this whole issue of no excuses charters, and the opinion by some out there that black children need to be in this very tough no excuses environment. And you and I both know that that's a controversial point of view, but I want your take on it, because do you think that the problem of black girls is that they need a tougher environment, or is this no excuses idea just counterproductive? What's your take on that?
I wonder, why is this this grit, if you will, this kind of resiliency that we call upon, is only good for black girls? If it's good for, what's good for children is good for children.
I think the resilience issue is across the board, but the toughness, the no excuses, definitely seems to be a direction toward minority students. Absolutely.
I think it's a blanket. A blanket practice, if you will, saying that you got to pick yourself up. This whole bootstraps mentality. That's not America. That's not how America was built. We were afforded care. We were afforded concern. I think those who need the most help should be given just that. I think that it varies from student to student. I know that let's say my own child, she would not do well in an environment that, you got to figure it out. You got to be tough. You got to be strong. Not everyone is built like that.
You sent to the corner if you make a mistake.
Right, or
I would
even
not show up in school the next day.
Right. Oftentimes, schools tell us what we don't know, as opposed to celebrating what we do know and helping us to grow. Schools should be incubators for the human condition. It shouldn't worsen it. And I think this bootstrap or this grit mentality creates a toughness that is often counterproductive and creates hostility and environments wherein not only teachers can't be effective, but students won't learn.
Now that you had your chance to do your study, and I know it's ongoing, but you really did come up with some recommendations that you felt would make the school environment better for black girls. What are some of the things that you think? What are some of the policy changes we could make that would improve things?
Well, I'd love to see more affinity groups.
And what's an affinity group?
Affinity groups is simply like people coming together doing things that they enjoy. Let's say if a group of girls like reading, then we'd have a book club. If a group of girls like sewing, we'd have a knitting club. So it's simply when you actually ask students what it is that they want or need, and then you make those extracurricular activities available to them. Also, I would say mental health. I think our kids are under a lot of pressure, particularly black girls. They have these unrealistic expectations and stereotypes, and just a reality that oftentimes, I don't think is celebrates them. It doesn't affirm them. And I think that we need to give them an outlet, people to talk to, or even just how do you unpack that? How do you understand and deconstruct kind of what's happening to you? And more importantly, how can you prepare for an environment that may not be nice to you? And how do you have tools to say no, and to be firm, and to be graceful, and to be, you know, proud of who you are, to celebrate the best in you, in terms, as opposed to saying, you know, here's what you don't know, or here's what's wrong with you. What about here's what's right with you? And having someone a professional in particular, unpack this reality and help them to become better stewards, if you will. And
what about the teachers themselves? Is there any kind of professional development that you see that would be helpful, that we should be implementing?
Cultural competency. I think teachers should, many of them should not live in their respective community, but one of my colleagues did proffer that, you know, imagine like the same that we offer for police officers.
If you say that about the,
right, live in the neighborhood that you police. Well, imagine if you had to live in the neighborhood where your students are. You know, imagine how much knowledgeable you would be, not only of your students, but of culture and their realities. So then you'd be far more mindful in the words you use when you speak to them, or even what you expect from them. And you wouldn't lessen your expectations, you would raise them, but you do so mindfully and meaningfully, and seek ways to engage not only students, but also the family and their respective community.
You also mentioned posting clear rules and regulations. Why do you think that's important?
I think oftentimes, particularly with law enforcement agents, rules are upheld subjectively. I mean, a rule is a rule, I understand that, but I think when if you're being stopped for a police officer, they have to tell you why they're stopping you. If you're going to write a referral or discipline a child, you should make clear not only why you're disciplining them, but just what that consequence is. And these consequences should be posted, and they should be carried out with fidelity, meaning if it's a rule, then make sure all students follow that rule, not just the students who you deem, you know, who need to follow it, and those who don't, because it can be arbitrary.
Be consistent, be clear. That's important for all our children.
Fair.
Know what it is that I'm disciplining you for.
Yes.
What is it? What are the rules and regs?
Right.
We're running out of time. I'm just going to ask you quickly. We always ask, what do women want? And you ask, what do black girls want? What do black girls want?
Black girls want to be celebrated, respected, cared for, almost a Pavlov's hierarchy of needs. We all want the same thing. And so I think, but transparency, the fairness, and just being able to be themselves. Black girls want to stand in their own light. They want to be who they are.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this very important conversation. Dr. Terri Watson from CCNY. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Don't go away. We'll be right back with our Ed Bites. Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites. Academic research has long pointed to the connections between reading and writing. Those who read a lot tend to be better writers. Quartz reports on a study in the International Journal of Business Administration that indicates that what college students read can greatly affect how well they write. What kind of reading makes for the best writers? Students who read academic journals, literary fiction, or general nonfiction wrote with greater syntactic maturity than those who read mysteries, fantasy, science fiction, or web-based aggregators like Reddit, Tumblr, and BuzzFeed. The top scores went to those who read academic journals, the lowest to those who only read web-based content. Last month, EdCast examined the anxieties faced by college students and the newer trends in the college experience. A recent study by the Chronicle of Higher Education confirms that today's college students prefer to stay close to home. Freshman enrollment trends throughout the U.S. reveal that most students choose to stay in-state or remain close to their home state. Teacher shortages and high turnover rates are endemic to school systems, and the explanation may be obvious. The gap between teachers' pay and that of comparable workers is greater than ever before. According to studies conducted by the Economic Policy Institute, the relative wage gap for all public school teachers was at a record -17% in 2015. The study's authors note that recruiting and retaining high-quality teachers is crucial in K-12 education, and that fair compensation is necessary to attract the best. Over the years, EdCast has brought you the latest findings on the impact of video games on student behavior and academic performance. The findings are often contradictory. So now comes a new twist, comparing students who play video games with those who use social media. This time, research undertaken in Australia reveals that 15-year-olds who play online video games scored above average in math, reading, and science. But those who engage in social networking, such as Facebook, scored below average. The more students use social media, the worse their scores tended to be. That's it for this edition of EdCast. Till next time, class dismissed.